Chapter 61. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. 61 Tender kisses and confused emotions. I could barely sit up on the long sofa, but Ace was already on his feet. My hands quickly moved to put back on my scattered pieces of clothing. Starting off with pulling my bra down to cover my breasts and buttoning my shirt. Then I reached for my panties and began pulling it on. "Thank you." I thanked him softly. Ace was already heading for the door, but he did stop in his tracks at my words. "I don't work for free," Ace said before he turned back and winked at me. While I followed Ace back to his office, I wondered how he could find the time to help me out with my work. Isn't he supposed to have back meetings in the afternoon as well? I pulled out my phone and checked his calendar and wasn't surprised that he had so many meetings lined up. Don't tell me that he's planning to skip out on all of these meetings just to help me out with my work. This is going to be a big disaster and a huge inconvenience for so many people. "Ace, I think you should go to your meetings as planned," I quickly suggested before I lost my nerve. "Why?" Ace asked like he had no clue what I was talking about. "You can't skip out on so many meetings. There are people waiting for you. They need your help and your guidance, so you need to turn up," I explained as I tried to keep up with his long strides. Suddenly, Ace's phone started vibrating. He looked at his phone screen before clicking his tongue in clear annoyance. Despite his attitude, he still decided to answer the call. "Yes, it's me. No, I won't be attending today. I'm sick," Ace said before coughing the fakest cough I had ever heard in my life. After that he just hung up casually before he turned and offered me his hand. I stared back at him with my mouth hanging open. Why did you do that?" I asked in shock. "Do what?" he asked, completely guiltless. "Lie and tell them that you're sick," I replied, still stunned. "I wasn't lying. I'm sick, you just have no idea," he replied before waving for me to follow him. "He's not sick. He's so healthy that it's starting to bother me." Time flew by so fast when I was working with Ace. Before I knew it, it was already dark outside when I looked out the window of his office. Because his office was high up in the building, the view that I could see of the outside world looked spectacular. Especially now that it was dark, the lights in the city were on, which just made view look that much more magical. The mix of various shining lights in the distance made me feel like I was gazing out into a field of stars. "Like the view?" Ace asked when he caught me admiring the view beyond his window. "Yeah. It's beautiful," I replied before turning around to smile at him. "I guess I'm too used to seeing it that I don't realize how beautiful it really is anymore," Ace said dryly. "That sounds a little depressing," I mumbled, and he smiled back at me. "Should we call it a day?" Ace suggested. "We worked for many hours already." After Ace reviewed my work and gave me guidance here and there, I had a much better picture of what I needed to achieve and what exactly I needed to do to get there. That alone was much more helpful than I ever imagined. I quickly found out that Ace was a very good coach, and although he was extremely strict and demanding, I knew that he was doing it all for my own good. The instructions that he gave were clear and how he explained things made it easier for me to understand. "I guess so. I'm almost done, so I can easily wrap this up when I get home," I replied with a cheerful smile. "Close your eyes," Ace said as he came to stand right next to me. I looked up from where I was sitting to stare at his face in confusion. Why does he want me to close my eyes? "Why?" I asked in wonder. "Well, I don't mind if you keep them open," Ace said carefreely. My body froze when I felt his hand on my shoulders before his face came extremely close. My eyes widened more in disbelief when I felt his warm lips on mine. I could see his long lashes very close to my face. His kiss was soft and very gentle. It was very different from the way that he had kissed me before or when he kissed me while we were doing it. Slowly, my eyes drifted closed just like he had wanted. His kiss was patient and even bordered loving. It was a kiss that left me feeling every confused and conflicted inside. My emotions became a big mess as he began kissing me softly from various angles. It was a while before his tongue probed my mouth so softly before I naturally parted my lips to welcome his entry into the depth of my mouth. I moaned softly into our sweet kiss and Ace cupped the side of my face with his large and warm hand as our kiss deepened. Just like all the times that he touched me before, I found myself yearning greedily for more of him. The sound of Ace's mobile phone ringing interrupted our series of fervent and longing kisses. I hated how disappointed I was when his lips left mine before Ace took out his phone and quickly excused himself. The call must be very important for him to react the way that he did. I was tired and my brain was quite fried, but I felt very fulfilled. Unlike my presentation from before, I felt like I had a lot more meaningful information packed in along with my thoughts on the issues. Just when Ace disappeared into a meeting room, my phone started vibrating. I glanced down to see that I had received messages from my colleague back at the design department. To be continued. Chapter 62. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 62 Emotional misunderstanding. We had a chat group that I shared with various other girl friends in the office. Usually, we never discussed anything serious, so the group was filled with gossip and girl talk. I found reading through it a good way to relieve stress whenever I'm going through a tough patch at work. I never paid serious attention to what went on in the group, but the notification that appeared on my phone screen caught my attention. Girls. I got some super rare photos from Kyle's wedding. I'm so jealous of his bride. I want a husband like Kyle too. We can all dream on. Let's go drinking soon, work has been so busy these days. Binge on these photos first, yeah. We can dream of our dream wedding. My phone vibrated in succession as the girls typed in their responses in the chat group. Then my phone continued to vibrate as various photos of Kyle's wedding were sent into the chat. The steamy session that I had with Ace in his nap room helped me forget all about Kyle and his betrayal, but this little reminder brought back all the negative emotions that I had been desperately holding back. I stared down at my phone as I debated with myself about what I should do. Seeing the photos wasn't going to make me feel any better, but if I didn't face it head on, then it's probably going to take a very long time for me to move on and completely let go and forget Kyle and the relationship that we had. What should I do? I was munching on my lower lip as my mind debated with my heart on what to do next. One thing was clear to me: I can't keep relying on Ace's comfort as a way for me to escape reality anymore. Although it wasn't planned or intentional, I had sex with Ace to forget about Kyle. Then I ended up letting him do all those lewd things to me simply because I enjoyed and couldn't resist his touch. In the end, I'm probably no better than Kyle. Just like he was using me all along, I'm using Ace and the pleasure that he can give me to help make me forget. I'm so disgusting. If I can't forget about Kyle, I'll just keep on using Ace. That is just not acceptable to me. Before I could change my mind, my finger tapped on the notification to open it. An image of Kyle standing next to his bride showed up on my screen. For a moment, I was stunned. It just felt so unreal to me. Hearing people gossiping about it and seeing a photo of him at his wedding felt extremely very different. The photo rammed home the message that Kyle had indeed moved on to marry someone else. Because our relationship had to be kept a secret from everyone, even my closest friends at work doesn't know that I used to date Kyle. She even sent me photos of Kyle and his bride smiling together in their wedding attires. He sure looked very happy smiling in the photo so brightly with his new bride. I wondered if he ever smiled like that when he was with me. He looked extremely happy in the photo and so did his bride. My chest started feeling slightly tight and it felt a little harder to breathe. There was a slight stinging sensation at the back of my eyes, but my lips curved into a slight smile as I reminisce on the first time that we met and the last time that we spoke as a couple. It was good while it lasted, right, Kyle? The future will be very different for us now. Kyle has moved on to his new phase in life without me in it while I. Suddenly, when I thought about my future, the first thought that came to me wasn't thoughts of my career, my new role, or achieving my dreams. The first thing that entered my head was an image of Ace's attractive face as he stared down at me with the fire of desire smoldering intensely in the depths of his amber eyes. Ace. Whenever I thought of him, I feel a feeling that I don't quite understand. Undeniably, I realized that I was drawn to him, however, he also scared me, but even then, I just didn't want to run away from him. I shook my head in my confusion. This is ridiculous, I don't even know what I'm feeling anymore. Focus on your work, Karina. It was clear at that point that I had completely underestimated the standard and expectation of working as part of the CEO's office. Ace probably knew this and was trying to help me out, yet I'm thinking of irrelevant things. I should focus more on my work. Something wrong. I was too wrapped up in my thoughts to realize that Ace had returned from his phone call and was now standing right behind me. That it's nothing. I mumbled as I quickly put my phone away when I realized that the screen still showed a picture of Kyle and his bride. Ace, didn't see that just now, right? I watched his face to gauge his reaction, but he seemed the same as always. Relieved that I must be overthinking things, I returned my focus to the work that was in front of me. So far, I was making very good progress thanks to Ace's guidance. Really? Ace asked as he stared down at me. Suddenly, my throat felt very dry, and I wasn't sure if I could answer him. Ace's eyes held mine and I started shrinking back. Once again, I found his presence intimidating, and right now the air around him had changed. It was like he had just transformed into his devil form right in front of my eyes, although nothing about this appearance had visibly changed apart from the merciless look in his eyes. I nodded to signal that I was really fine. Ace didn't say anything, but I winced and looked away when he placed his hands flat on the desk before leaning down until his face was at my level, capturing me between his arms and the table behind me. To be continued. Chapter 63. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 63. Undressing him suddenly, I felt very cornered, and I was forced to stare deeply into his amber eyes. After a moment of staring deeply into each other's eyes, Ace was the one who looked away first while letting out a long sigh of disappointment. I thought you got over him already. I feel like all my efforts have been wasted after I spent the entire night comforting you, and then some more on the following days, Ace said with a mix of disappointment and concern. I doubt it's not what you think. I quickly denied. So, he did see the photo on my phone just now. I didn't know why I felt that way, but suddenly, I felt extremely guilty for looking at Kyle's photo, and it didn't help that Ace also had to see it. What am I thinking? Ace asked as he cocked his head to the side. Ace waited patiently as his eyes narrowed at me while I struggled to come up with an answer. That I'm still not over Kyle. I mumbled softly. So, are you over him? Ace asked softly as his face moved even closer to mine. He's so close that we might as well be kissing right now. I couldn't bear to meet his eyes anymore, so I had to look away. The truth was that I wasn't sure if I was completely over Kyle. I didn't feel the same way about him anymore, and I probably had started to get over him, but I couldn't just completely forget about him immediately. I started saying before I realized that it would sound so ridiculous if I said that I'm working on getting over Kyle. I looked up from the floor to see a clear look of disappointment and displeasure on Ace's face. My face felt numb as I started feeling guilty for how I was feeling. Why did things have to turn out this way? I wished I didn't decide to open up that photo. Why is Ace mad, and why do I feel so hurt seeing him like this? Ace. I whispered his name in a small voice. I wanted to apologize, but I wasn't sure what I would be apologizing for, and I was certain that he didn't want to hear an apology from me either. I didn't have to think or worry for much longer, because when Ace lifted my chin with his fingers and crushed his lips against mine, I closed my eyes and concentrated purely on the bliss of his kiss. His warm and soft lips molded against mine as he pressed his lips roughly against my lips. He kissed me over and over from various angles before the wet tip of his tongue snaked out to lick and tease my lips. "Open your mouth for me, Rena," Ace commanded in a voice thick with desire. I did exactly as he instructed, and Ace thrusted his tongue deftly into my mouth. A soft moan escaped me as his tongue grinded against mine in a passionate dance. Just like before, Ace ignited a fire inside of me that burned so hot in my core. I began kissing him back fervently, grinding my tongue against his to taste even more of him. Ace's large hand cupped the side of my face as he deepened our kiss. By the time that he removed his tongue from my mouth, I was a panting mess. I guess that one night wasn't enough. Don't worry, I'll fuck you as many times as it takes for you to forget all about him. Ace whispered seductively into my ear before I felt the hot and wet heat of his mouth sucking and licking on my earlobe. Ah! I moaned at the lewd and wet sounds that filled my ear and invaded my senses. Ace nibbled on my ear before he pulled me up by my arms and I found myself up on my unsteady feet. The look of pure desire in his eyes shocked and excited me at the same time as his arms circled my body and he began lifting me up. I felt the hardness of the tabletop against my ass when he sat me down on top of the table. His large hands nudged my knees apart and soon he was standing in between my spread legs. Ace bent his head down and captured my lips in a heated kiss as if to continue from where we just left off. I kissed him back as my body felt like it was burning from his kiss. My core throbbed with need and desire. Just like before, I forgot about everything when I was kissing Ace and he was touching me. I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him closer so that I could kiss him even deeper than before. Ace is such a good kisser. I felt like my entire body was melting from his kisses and it was such an addictive feeling. It wasn't long before just kissing wasn't enough for both of us, and we started to explore each other's bodies with our hands. Frantically, we began stripping each other of our clothes. My hands pulled desperately at Ace's suit before he helped me shrug it off. Ace buried his face in the side of my neck as his hand expertly unbuttoned the small buttons in front of my shirt. I moaned as he kissed and sucked on the side of my neck. I ran my hands along the front of his hard chest, feeling his ripped muscles against the palm of my hands through his shirt. Ace parted my shirt to the side to reveal my body to him as he lifted his head to stare down at my heaving chest. His heated gaze on my body turned me on even more and I wanted to remove his shirt so that I could touch his torso directly. Boldly, I pulled him closer before my hands busied itself with hastily unbuttoning his shirt. Ace watched my desperate struggle with a small smile on his lips. "Oh!" I moaned in satisfaction as I pressed my hands flat against the muscles of his chest. To be continued. Chapter 64. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 64. Teasing the beast. Finally, I had Ace's shirt open at the front and I could feel him directly with my hands. His body felt much warmer to the touch now that I could touch his bare skin directly. I closed my eyes and relished in the feel of his muscles moving under the palm of my hands as he breathed in and out. Slowly, I traced my hand down from his chest to the beautifully formed muscles of his stomach. His six-pack is so beautiful, I thought to myself as I admired his beautiful body as if it was a rare sculpture of art. If you stare too much, I'm going to start feeling shy. Ace said teasingly. You. Shy. I replied in pure disbelief before I smiled up teasingly at him. I could never imagine someone like Ace feeling shy about anything at all. Why would he have to feel shy about this body? It's so beautiful. Ace took in a sharp breath as my hand progressed further down his abdominals. My eyes were already on my planned next destination as my hand slipped even further down. My turn, Ace said as he grabbed my exploring hands in his. Ah! I let out a cry when he pinned me beneath him on the table. I stared up into his captivating eyes as he pinned my body beneath him. Without waiting for me to recover from my surprise, Ace's hands were already on my breasts, squeezing and teasing them through the cups of my bra. Loud lewd moans escaped my lips as the pleasure of his touch made my mind feel numb with desire. I felt the slightly cold air on the bare skin of my breasts after Ace peeled away the cups of my bra to reveal my soft flesh. His gaze burned into my tits before his hand cupped them. I moaned and whimpered as his hands began moving against my soft womanly flesh. I love playing with your tits, Ace groaned as his hand massaged my breasts rougher than before. I cried out at the intense pleasure of his touch as my hardened nipples pushed against the palm of his hands. My body writhed on the table, thrusting my chest shamelessly upward to invite him to touch and play with my breasts more. Ah. Ace. I cried out before I placed the back of my hand against my mouth to block out the loud lewd sounds that I was making. Ace buried his face in between my breasts and breathed in my scent deeply. His hand continued to pump one of my breasts as he dipped his head low to take my erect nipple into his mouth. The warm and wet sensation around my nipple as he sucked hard on it drove me crazy with lust. I ran my fingers through his hair as I lifted my chest off the table, thrusting my breasts towards his face. Ace sucked me harder, and I cried out his name passionately before trying to moan in my lusty moans. Don't hold your moans in. I want to hear them. Ace commanded. My core felt so hot as it throbbed with my desire for him as my pussy clenched desperately. Ace sucked on my nipple loudly as his fingers teased and pinched my other peak. The pleasure that surged through my body made my pussy quiver with desire as it got wetter and wetter for him. My voice started to sound hoarse from all the moaning and screaming that I had been doing. Ace lifted his head and stared down at me with intense desire. I knew that we had the same thought in our minds. We couldn't get enough of each other, and the way his hands moved desperately as he pushed me up further onto the desk and grabbed my knees to spread my legs told me beyond words how much he desired me. His desire only worked to turn me on even more, and I knew that I had soaked my panties again with my love juices. It was unbelievable how much I wanted him even after he made me come earlier in the day. I'm going to fuck you now. Are you ready? Ace asked needlessly. I was too embarrassed to say anything, so I just nodded at him. In reality, I couldn't wait to feel him inside of me either. Ace pulled my skirt up before roughly pulling down my panties and swiftly removing it from my legs. The unwanted little piece of garment fell on the floor before Ace's hands quickly went to his belt. I bit my lower lip in anticipation as my eyes were glued to his crotch and the large bulge that had formed there. Just like Ace had offered before, I wanted to see his cock. So badly. Want to undress me? Ace offered as he grinned down at me. He looked so mischievous, and I knew that I was playing with a very hot and dangerous fire, but I just couldn't resist him. Ace reached out a hand towards me and I willingly placed my hand into his. He pulled me up into a sitting position so that I could work on freeing his virile cock. Since we've come this far, there was no need to hide away my desire for him any longer. My hands hurriedly unbuckled his belt before zipping the zipper of his pants. You're very efficient at this. Ace complimented teasingly. I gasped when I finally freed his cock from its restraint. His cock was much bigger, longer and thicker than I had ever imagined. I gulped, shocked and very amazed at the size and dimension of his cock. Ace's thick rod stood up proudly in between his legs and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. It looked so thick and so hard. Want to touch it? Ace asked invitingly when he caught me staring at his cock. I looked up at his face briefly before I nodded my head slowly. Yes, I wanted to touch it. The veins on the surface of his cock bulged clearly and his cock twitched a little under my gaze as if it also wanted me to touch it. Slowly, I reached out my hand towards his cock. The heat of his hard love stick grazed my fingertip as I slowly stroked my fingertips along his massive length. I heard Ace take in a sharp breath before he moaned softly as I continued to softly stroke his gigantic member. To be continued. Chapter 65. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 65. He's an XXL. Ace closed his eyes as if in bliss and I knew that I was doing him right. Feeling a little bolder than before, I wrapped my fingers around the thick girth of his hot rod. His cock felt hot in my hand. I began stroking his cock up and down slowly yet firmly while I looked up at Ace to gauge his reaction. Ace stared down at me with intense desire in his eyes as I continued to pump his cock in my hand. Rena. Ace groaned my name softly as his hips began moving, thrusting his cock into my hand. I felt so proud that I could make him feel good too. The look of lust on his face turned me on and I began pumping my hand faster up and down his cock. His cock felt hotter in my hand, and I could feel him getting even bigger than longer than before. Just how big can his cock get? L.RG If I tried to put this massive beast inside me, will it even fit? Stop, Rena. Ace commanded suddenly as he grabbed my wrist. I looked up at him in surprise as I wondered if I had done something wrong to displease him. That shouldn't be the case, though. From what I could see, he seemed to be enjoying my loving attention. Did I do something wrong? I asked in a small voice as worry flooded my mind. Not at all. It felt too good. Ace replied with a gentle smile. I stared at him as my heart skipped a few beats. His gentle voice and how he just smiled at me, it was all very new to me. It was like I was seeing another side of Ace that I had never seen before, and I found myself even more attracted to him. If we spend more time together, would he show me his other expressions like just now? Can you put this on me? Ace requested as he handed me a condom. Oh, right, we should put this on before we. In the heat of the moment, I had to admit that I had completely forgotten about protection. I blushed slightly before I nodded. My hand reached for the condom and took it from his hand before my eyes stared at the large XXL text on the package of the condom that he handed me before I smiled weakly up at him. Is this thing really going to fit inside of my dear little pussy hole? I truly appreciated the care that he put into making sure that our sex would be safe. It would be a problem if I got pregnant now and I wasn't on the pills either. However, it felt a little strange that he was asking me to put it on his cock. I didn't have a lot of experience putting a condom on a man because most of my lovers would do it themselves, but we can all learn, right? Ace watched as I tore open the condom back before positioning it over the engorged head of his cock. I knew that he was very big, but to have to use XXL-sized condom is just on another level entirely. Carefully, I rolled the rubber down the long length of his cock. Good girl, Ace complimented in a deeply satisfied voice. Before I could respond to him, Ace pushed me down onto the table and got on top of me. The gentle and smiling Ace was gone now, and in his place was a version of Ace that raging with lust and desire. He kissed my lips roughly as his hand rove all over my body, squeezing my breasts, caressing the curves of my waist and hips before settling on caressing my inner thighs. I'm going to fuck you now. Are you ready, Rena? Ace asked needlessly. Ace quickly lifted my legs up and parted them widely apart. I moaned softly when I felt my pussy being stretched before my love juices started leaking out of my hole. Rena, he called my name as if he wanted my full and undivided attention. Ace. I whispered his name as I stared back deeply into his amber eyes. The thick head of his cock lodged itself between my trembling pussy lips and I knew that Ace was ready to take me. He was massive and I knew that it would hurt even though I was nowhere near being a virgin anymore. I took in a deep breath before breathing out slowly while I tried to relax my pussy to accommodate his entry. Ace reared his hips back and then his thick and hot cock stretched my opening before penetrating deeply into my wet hole. I cried out at the pain of his entry. Although I had prepared myself for this, it still hurt. He's so big and so hard. Ace must have sensed my discomfort because he stilled above me as he looked down at my face. You're very tight, Rena. Ace groaned. I'm sorry. I whimpered. Ace stroked my hair before he smiled down encouragingly at me. His cock twitched inside of me, and my pussy clenched harder around his enormous shaft as the pain slowly started to subside. I don't think my pussy was extra tight, but his cock was just abnormally large. You're very big. I mumbled softly with a hint of complaint in my voice. Your body will get used to it after I do you a few times, Ace said with a devilish smirk. His mischievous expression made my heart skip a beat again. It was just so like him to be thinking of the next time even though we're still in the middle of doing it. It was clear that Ace didn't intend for this to be our last time indulging in this lusty pleasure between us while I wasn't sure what I wanted for the future. I nodded my head slowly at him to tell him that I felt fine now. It didn't hurt anymore, and it seemed like my pussy had somehow adjusted to his massive thickness. However, the problem wasn't over yet. Ace was only halfway in and there was so much more of his cock that I still had to take inside of me. Ace reared back his hips and his cock slid out of my hole a little before he thrusted sharply forward. To be continued. Chapter 66. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 66. Height of passion. Ah! I cried out loudly at the mix of pain and pleasure. His gigantic member pounded deeply into my hole until he managed to bury his entire length into my wet pussy hole. He stretched and filled me up completely. I felt so full of Ace. Soon the pain faded, and I felt so much pleasure that I thought that I would climax on the spot. My pussy walls wrapped around his thick girth in deep satisfaction. "Are you okay?" Ace asked with concern. "Yes. I'm fine, that's so," I said before trailing off. I wanted him to start moving. I wanted him to fuck my hole with his thick cock. Ace's hands gripped my thighs and then parted them wider. He moved his hips closer to mine, screwing his cock even deeper inside of me while I moaned my pleasure. Ace then gripped the sides of my hips, and I knew that he was ready to give it to me fast and hard. Ah! 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 I cried out loudly at the intense pleasure of his thick cock pumping wildly in and out of my hole. My pussy clenched hungrily around his thick girth as if it couldn't get enough of him pounding against my pleasure spots. "Seems like your pussy still remembers my cock very well from that night," Ace groaned before he smirked down at me. That night. That night. Ace's point of view. When I left the office to attend a launch party at one of the new luxury hotels that had just opened in the city, I never imagined that I would run into her there, and definitely not in the state that she was in. At first, I told myself that it wasn't my problem and that I should just leave her there. Since she was seated at a table for four, I knew that she wasn't out drinking and getting drunk all alone. She probably had some friends with her, but I couldn't see them around anymore. Ace. I turned at the call of my name to see an old friend heading my way. The moment that I took my eyes off of her, I realized just how worried about her I really was. After putting on a presentable smile, I chatted casually with my friend. We shared small talk that had no significance, and I nodded along to his story while my eyes wandered to the young woman sitting alone with a shot glass in her hand. She tipped her head back and gulped down another shot, and I found myself wincing. "Thanks, I'll see you around for sure," I said as I patted my friend's shoulder. It was time that our non-consequential conversation came to an end. I looked around as I wondered where all her friends had gone off to. While I hesitated about what to do, if anything, my choice was robbed from me when the girl somehow lost her balance. I watched in shock as her body slowly slipped from the chair that she was sitting on. "Karina." I called her name close to her ear. I was surprised at how close we were until I realized that I was holding her body in my arms to break her fall. A loud sigh escaped my lips as I closed my eyes in defeat. I had no idea why I should help her, but somehow, I did. Maybe it was because I knew why she was out drinking tonight, or maybe it was because I sympathized with her. Honestly, I didn't know, and I didn't understand myself. While cursing at something as ridiculous as fate, I found myself lifting her body up into my arms with ease. Surprisingly, her body felt light in my arms. Karina had her eyes closed when I looked down at her face, but the fact that she was murmuring something told me that she wasn't sleeping. "I need to get her home. Somehow." "Karina. Karina. Where do you live?" I asked her after calling her name a couple of times. She might as well be dead with how unresponsive she was at that moment. I rolled my eyes as I carried her away from all the prying eyes looking at us. A staff member was helpful enough when I asked him for a private room at the bar for her to rest to sober up a bit while I tried to figure out where she lived so that I could send her home. After placing her on a sofa, I took out her phone thinking that I could call her friend or anyone on her recently called list. There's got to be someone who can tell me where she lives or someone besides her rotten ex-boyfriend who can come and pick her up. I picked up her phone and cursed loudly when I couldn't unlock it. I even tried scanning her thumb but apparently, she didn't set up that biometric function. How am I supposed to know how to unlock her phone? Karina. K-A-R-I-N-A, I called her name loudly. She was as silent and as lifeless as a doll. Well, she can sort herself out when she wakes up. It was all her fault anyways that she ended up like this. I was about to walk out the door but a loud thumping sound of something hitting the floor made me turn around. I reached a hand up to scratch my head in a mix of confusion and amazement at the sight of Karina laying on the floor next to the sofa. How did she manage to roll off? Karina stirred and wailed like she was in pain before quieting down. Hell! I cursed underneath my breath. The next thing I knew, her body was in my arms again and I was walking out of the door. After checking into one of the suite rooms of the hotel, I carried Karina into the room. The door closed behind us and locked automatically. Karina still had her eyes closed and seemed unconscious, so it came as a rather big surprise when she refused to let go of my suit when I tried to lay her down on the bed. My name is Karina. Karina slurred before smiling at me. Oh, please. To be continued. Chapter 67. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 67. Seducing the devil, I know who you are. Stop it, you're so drunk, so just go to sleep, I said curtly as I tried to pry her hands from his chest. You can call me Rena, Karina purred before pulling at the front of my shirt with her hands. It seemed that the effects of the alcohol in her bloodstream made her unusually bold. Karina's hands started caressing my chest before moving upwards until she had her arm hooked around my neck. I stared at her in dismay and disbelief at the wanton act that she could put on while drunk. Kiss. Karina whispered as she pulled me down towards her while puckering her lips up for a kiss. At first, I thought that she was unconscious, but apparently that was no longer the case. I stared down at her face to see that her eyes were opened, and she was staring up right at my face. She parted her lips and licked her lower lip seductively before biting on it teasingly. Is she really that drunk? Karina continued pleading for me to kiss her as her arms tried to pull me down on top of her. When that didn't seem to work in her favor, she lifted her body up and boldly pressed her lips against mine. Her kiss was a chaste one and that confused me a little. Curious, I waited to see what she would do next while I placed a silent wager in my head that she would drop dead and fall asleep. My bet was off. Way off. I felt her fingers running through my hair as the tip of her tongue snaked out to lick my lips teasingly. Her eyes were still opened, and I didn't hesitate to keep mine opened as I watched her kiss and lick my lips. She tasted of alcohol, but I didn't mind. I was too curious to see what she was going to do. Although I knew that I should push her away and leave her to sleep until morning, I couldn't push her away. Maybe that was where I started to lose my good judgment or my self-control, or both. Ah. She moaned softly against my lips before she slipped the tip of her wet tongue between my lips. I parted my lips and her tongue thrusted right into my mouth and met mine. She tasted of sweet cocktail. Her hands moved from my hair to cup the side of my face as she boldly deepened our kiss. I let her explore my mouth with her tongue as she grinded her tongue against mine. She was not bad at this at all. Throughout it all, her eyes remained opened as she watched me intently and I did the same. I wondered if she would remember anything when morning came. She moaned louder when I began kissing her back. She reacted to my kiss by kissing me back more fervently. Our tongues dancing wildly together before I changed the angle of our kiss over and over again until she was breathless. I broke our kiss to let her get enough oxygen. Her lips were swollen a beautiful pink from the passionate kisses that we shared. While watching her pant with her lips swollen and parted, I realized that she is indeed very attractive in her own way. Karina. I called her name again to see if she would snap out of it. "Call me Rena," she slurred before smiling so carefreely at me that my heart skipped a beat all on its own. She looked even younger when she smiled, and she was already very young. She started giggling as if someone had told her one of the funniest jokes, and then her hand started stripping off her blazer before she began unbuttoning the buttons of her shirt. She was quite good at autopiloting, and I watched in amusement as her fingers expertly unbuttoned her shirt. She was fast. "Ah," she let out a sigh of relief as she stripped her blazer and shirt right off. My eyes widened before I started chuckling. Things no longer seemed that amusing to me when my eyes landed on her breasts that were covered in just her bra. Karina laid on the white sheet of the bed with her eyes closed. I breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, she'd fallen asleep just like she was supposed to. Once again, I was very wrong. Karina sat up and quickly unhooked her bra and removed it from her arms. Frankly, I was stunned at how fast she moved, and then her bra went flying to the other side of the room. I couldn't hold in my laugh when I saw her throw her bra away. When I looked back at her, I caught her leaning closer to me on the bed. My eyes drifted downwards from her face to her now naked breasts. Her breasts were very shapely, they looked soft, and her nipples had hardened. She was undoubtedly very aroused. "Karina, what are you doing?" I asked calmly when she reached for my hand and entwined her fingers with mine seductively. She stared deeply into my eyes before she smiled a little shyly. My lips curved into a little smile on its own, and I couldn't resist wanting to see what she was going to do next. Unlike her shy smile, her next move was bold. I sucked in a breath when I felt the softness of her womanly flesh fill the palm of my hand after she had guided my hand to her breast. Her hand overlapped mine and urged for me to squeeze and fondle her soft breast as she began moaning from pleasure. Her breasts were the exact size that I liked, and soon I found myself groping and massaging both her breasts with my hands while she moaned and cried out. Her reactions were sexy and adorable at the same time. It was clear that she was enjoying the attention that I was giving her. Her body writhed as she thrusted her chest upwards invitingly. Naturally, her lewd moans and the feel of her breasts filling my hands turned me on as well. To be continued. Chapter 68. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 68 Partners in desire. I squeezed her breasts a little faster and rougher, and she cried out louder. My loins throbbed with desire as my cock got hard. I could feel my member growing harder and bigger in my pants as I continued to pleasure her breasts before pinching and playing with her hardened nipples. "Ah! Yes," she cried out when I pinched her nipples hard. She was enjoying herself a little too much for someone who was supposed to be drunk. Although I knew that she was reacting like this because she had lost all control over her body and her desires, I couldn't resist giving her what she so badly wanted. Then there was also the fact that she was currently heartbroken. This was probably the way that she wanted and needed to be comforted right now, I thought as I watched her bite on lower lip before letting out another lewd moan. Her hand started caressing my arms before she lowered her hand to pull up her skirt. She lifted her hips off the bed, and in one swift moment, she pulled up her skirt to reveal her thighs and her lacy panties. My body froze in shock while Karina swiftly removed her panties from her legs. Then she spread her legs, and my eyes were naturally drawn to her pussy like moths to a flame. My loins tightened and my cock throbbed with even more desire for her as my eyes stared at her pussy. Karina moaned softly, and I immediately imagined her moaning and crying out my name as her body writhed under mine, thrusting her hips wantonly against mine as I thrusted my hard cock fast and hard into her wet hole. That thought was extremely dangerous, and so were my undeniable desire for her. When I carried her to this room, I never thought that we would get this far. Neither did I imagine that Karina would be this sexy in bed. She really was a temptation that was hard to deny. I took in a deep breath as I fought with my internal demons for self-control. I'm an experienced man with excellent self-control, I told myself as I tore my eyes from the cleft in between her legs and forced myself to stand up from the bed. "Stay. Don't go," she whimpered pleadingly. I glanced down in disbelief to find her arms around my waist. The slight pressure of her head against my back made me notice just how tightly she was hugging me from behind as she begged repeatedly for me to stay. What am I supposed to do? Slowly, I turned around in her arms and she stared up at me. I could see desire and longing swimming in the depths of her eyes as her eyes met mine. Suddenly, nothing mattered anymore. Everything will sort itself out when morning came. Ah! Karina moaned in extreme satisfaction as I climbed onto the bed and got on top of her. I kissed her and she kissed me back in wild abandon. Her lips tasted so sweet and my desire for her intoxicated my mind. I kissed her over and over again like it would never be enough as my hands pumped her breasts roughly. She moaned her desire into my mouth as I traced my hands along the curves of her body. When my hands reached the hot wet mess in between her legs, she cried out and thrusted her hips upwards invitingly, pushing her flooded pussy against my fingers. "You're so wet, Rena," I whispered seductively into her ear while using the nickname that she had begged me to call her by. I stroked her opening a couple of times, feeling her juices coat my fingers. Her juices were warm and very slippery. I thrusted my middle finger inside of her hole and that made her moan loudly. Her hips instinctively began thrusting up and down as her pussy clenched around my finger. I could tell that she felt good, and I started thrusting my finger in and out of her hole. My finger slipped in and out of her easily thanks to her slimy juices. Let's see if I can add another finger inside, I muttered to myself before thrusting another finger into her. Ah! So good, she murmured as her hips bucked. Her pussy clenched tightly around my fingers before she began spreading her legs even wider apart. Her insides felt very wet and so warm that it almost felt hot. I began fingering her harder and faster as I enjoyed the sight of her body going wild from the pleasure that I was giving her. Her reactions were extremely sexy and beautiful at the same time. I never thought that she would be such a passionate girl. I crooked my finger and felt around the top of her pussy walls and soon found her G-spot. When I thrusted my fingers against it she cried out loudly. Her pussy immediately got wetter, and I felt the wetness gushing out to wet my fingers. She should be more than ready for my cock now. Slowly, I slipped my fingers out of her love hole before I pulled off my suit and shirt. Then my hands worked hastily to remove my belt and my pants until my thick and erect cock was freed. Playing around with her aroused me and my cock was already so hard that it was getting a little painful. Just like her, I also needed my pleasure and my satisfaction. I tore open the condom and rolled it swiftly down the length of my shaft. Of course, I wouldn't burden her with anything like unwanted pregnancy and other risks that could come from unprotected sex. She would probably be surprised enough already when she wakes up tomorrow morning. If she woke up early enough, I'll be here to comfort and explain things to her, but if not, then. Rena, that I'm going to fuck you now. Are you ready? I asked in case she would jump up and deny my advances. Obviously, that didn't happen. To be continued. Chapter 69. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 69. Just can't get enough. I parted her thighs apart with my hands as I positioned myself in between her legs. Karina moaned softly as I caressed her thighs. My cock twitched with excitement, and I realized that I couldn't wait to bury my entire length into her wet pussy. I grabbed my cock and positioned its thick head at her wet opening. She's so small and her pussy felt so tight when I fingered her earlier, and all I did was insert in 2 fingers. Although she was very wet, it would probably hurt her to take in a man of my size. I thrusted my hips forward and the tip of my cock plunged into her hole. She whimpered softly as her pussy tensed around my intruding cock. I stopped as I waited for her to relax and get used to my size. The heat of her pussy around the head of my cock felt so pleasurable and I couldn't wait to be inside her. I reared my hips back a little and thrust it harder into her, burying my cock even deeper into her hole. She cried out as she spread her legs even wider. Her hips began moving desperately, grinding her opening against my cock. It seemed like I wasn't the only one who wanted to fully enjoy this. "Rena, Rena," I groaned her name as I thrusted my cock deeper and deeper into her tight hole. She was small and very tight. I had a hard time pushing my huge and thick cock inside of her, but inch by inch she took my cock in until I was buried inside her to the hilt. Her pussy quivered and clenched around my cock. It felt good to be inside her and I couldn't wait to move. However, I waited until her pussy walls relaxed around my cock. Ah! 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 Rena cried out each time that I rammed my cock inside of her wet hole. I groaned as I began thrusting harder and faster into her tight cunt. Her pussy clenched and I felt her pussy walls rubbing along the entire length of my shaft as I continued to pound into her small body. It didn't take long for our body to move perfectly in sync to one another. I moaned her name when I noticed how compatible our bodies were as we enjoyed each other. Her hips lifted off the bed to meet my thrusts halfway, burying my cock even deeper into her hole with each thrust. The head of my cock thrusted against her womb, making her cry out. Her erotic face and lewd moans turned me on even more and I felt my cock growing bigger inside of her hole. I fucked her faster and harder. Her pussy felt amazing around my cock as she insides got wetter and hotter. My hips jerked my cock in and out of her hole. Her moans got wilder and louder and I knew that she was fast approaching her climax. I pounded my cock harder inside of her and she came screaming loudly, her pussy spasming wildly around my member. Her erotic face when she orgasmed captivated my attention and my cock stirred with an even more intense desire than before. I screwed my cock deeply into her hole as I lifted her ass off the bed so that I could pound my cock deeper into her tight hole. She started moaning again as I gave it to her faster and harder. The heat of her wetness surrounded my cock and that drove me closer and closer to my release. "Rena." I groaned her name when I finally came. It was a good thing that I had a condom on. After relishing in the pleasure of my orgasm, I slowly withdrew my hard cock from her hole. Rena came a lot too, I could see the milky release from her climax on the tip of the condom that I had on. I removed the condom from my cock and waited for my little friend to calm down. Rena had a satisfied smile on her lips as she was undoubtedly floating around in the joy of her intense orgasm from just now. After a short while, my cock only got harder. I looked at Rena before placing my hand in between her legs. Rena moaned with need when my fingers petted her swollen clit. She cried out when I pinched that little sensitive nub, and her hips began thrusting upwards. My lips curved into smirk. That she wanted more and I was more than willing to give it to her. I'll make love to her and comfort her until she falls asleep from exhaustion and then when she wakes up, she can start fresh and new. Carefully, I flipped her body onto her stomach and lifted her hips upwards, thrusting her ass towards me. My fingers parted her pussy lips as I admired the beautiful color of her pussy folds. Thankfully, I had many condoms on me. Better be prepared. I tore open one and slid it onto my rock-hard dick. "I'm so sorry, Rena. But once isn't enough for me." I apologized to her half-teasingly as I lodged the head of my cock at her opening. Rena moaned softly when she felt my cock press up against her pussy and her hips began moving, rotating her pussy, and grinding it against the head of my cock. I couldn't wait longer. I reared my hips back and screwed my cock hard and deep into her hole from behind while she cried out at the intensity of my thrust and my thickness suddenly stretching her love hole. Her pussy immediately clenched around my cock as if to welcome me. Her pussy was flooded, and her juices had started leaking out of her hole and onto her inner thighs. I found that to be such a turn-on. My lips called her name while she moaned her lust as our body mated wildly. That night, I made her come over and over again from my cock in various positions until she fell asleep in my arms. To be continued. Chapter 70. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 70 Irresistible Possessiveness. Karina, if you don't wake up, you're going to be late for work. I called out to her. I walked out of the shower and headed for the bed. Reaching my hand down, I shook her naked shoulder. She didn't even stir. This is what happens when you go out drinking on a weekday and you can't hold your drink properly. Just as I had decided last night, if she didn't wake up early then she's going to have to wake up all alone. After silently getting dressed, I looked down at her sleeping face one last time. The next time we meet, you're going to be my personal secretary. I hope that you'll behave and be a good and sexy girl. Without saying anything else to her, I bent down and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. I could forgive her if she turns up late for work today. Back to the present. Ace reared his hip back, withdrawing his entire cock out of me just to plunge it in over and over again. Each thrust was harder and deeper and the last, and I cried out as ecstasy robbed me from my ability to think about anything but the man who was giving me so much pleasure. Your pussy is so tight. Ace groaned before ramming his cock all the way into me again. Ednel.co, your cock.is so big, ah. Ace, that it's so deep. I cried out in between my lewd moans. His thick cock stimulated the walls of my pussy as he thrust it in and out of my hole. My pussy got so wet and lewd, wet sounds of his cock beating into the wetness in between my legs echoed all around his office. The loud squelching sounds that erupted from my pussy along with our moans and groans of pleasure turned me on even more. My hips thrusted wantonly upwards to meet his wild thrusts halfway, making his cock hit me even harder and deeper inside. Ace groaned as he exerted himself while I tried my best to keep my body from breaking from his intense thrusting. His cock hit against my womb with each thrust that made my legs feel weak. Your pussy is clenching hard around my cock. Do you like it here? Ace asked seductively. His cock hit the pleasure spot deep inside of my love tunnel and my pussy automatically clenched hard around his cock. It felt so good that I can't even begin to describe the lustful pleasure washing over my entire body in waves and rhythm to his cock thrusting deeply into my cunt. My pussy spasmed around his cock as it greedily tried to suck his thick rod in further into my hole. It's so deep. So good. I whimpered weakly. I let go of all control as I moaned like I was in heat. Sex with Ace felt so good. I never knew that being filled by him could feel so satisfying. It was as if my words turned him on even more than before, his movements became rougher and more demanding. No, don't, that I'm gonna come. I cried out as I lost myself to the pleasure of his hard and fast thrusts. I cried out his name as my climax took over me completely. My mind felt like it had shattered into a million tiny shards as my body spasmed uncontrollably. Ace continued pumping his cock wildly into my cunt and I knew that he was also close to his limit. Rena. Ace yelled my name in a low animalistic growl when his climax hit him. I felt his cock thrust one final deep thrust into my cunt before he stilled above me. Ace threw his head back and let out another growl as his cock twitched wildly inside of me. He lay down on top of me as he stroked the side of my face lovingly with his large hand. He placed a soft kiss on my temple before he hugged me tightly in his arms. After catching our breath, Ace got up and slowly withdrew his cock from my pussy. I moaned softly at the feel of his cock sliding out of my quivering hole. His exit was accompanied by my own wetness leaking out of my love hole. He made me come so much. Slowly, I opened my eyes lazily to see Ace looking intently at my face. While I felt heat rush to my cheek in embarrassment at what we had just done, Ace had an unreadable look in his eyes. For the life of me, I couldn't tell what he was thinking, and it seemed like he was at least slightly conflicted with himself. His large hand approached me before stroking my hair softly and tenderly. I closed my eyes again and enjoyed the comfort of his loving gesture. Although I couldn't see him, I knew that his eyes were on my face as he continued observing me. No one is allowed to break your heart, except for me. Ace whispered possessively into my ear. The warmth of his breath tickled my ear just like the possessiveness behind his words affected my heart. My eyes opened and met his before he smiled down at me. I didn't know what to say in response to his words, so I was thankful that he started kissing me. Unable to fully understand or voice my own mixed feelings, I kissed him back instead. I knew that I've just crossed the line and did something that I truly shouldn't have. This was different from when we did it back in the hotel because back then we were both probably drunk to a certain degree. This time, I was absolutely sober, and I couldn't use intoxication as a convenient excuse. It never ceased to amaze me how I didn't feel an ounce of regret for my actions. Instead, I enjoyed the safety of his strong arms around me as I let him comfort me and my tired and slightly broken spirit. I never truly understood until the moment that I felt his thick cock inside of me why people say that the most irresistible things are exactly the things that you can't truly have. To be continued.